Hi, nice to see you. I'm Dee Ray. I am the president of the Child-Centered Play Therapy International. We are really excited to be rolling out these webinars to hopefully help inform you about child-centered play therapy. And I have the honor of being able to talk about the history of child-centered play therapy, which is something I really enjoy talking about. This webinar is only going to be 1 hour, and I really like talking about the history, so I could go on for 5 hours. So I have been trying to kind of shorten it and focus it, and so that we can kind of delve into what is it like over the last 100 years, what has happened, and how have we gotten to the place we are with child-centered play therapy. So here we go. Just wanted to start off with talking about that we do have this long history in child-centered play therapy, and play therapy in general, and then how did we get to the place where child-centered is a recognized approach to play therapy. So it's hard to start off just talking about child-centered. We have to start off talking about generally about play therapy. And so I'll try to kind of cover that a little bit today. So we're going to start at the very beginning, a very good place to start about when did it come into general knowledge that play therapy was a thing? How did it become? And it really did start very philosophically on how we work with children. So the place we start, especially with child-centered, is talking about philosophy, and so I will be very much concentrating on this idea of the philosophical underpinnings of child-centered play therapy, the grounding in theory, and how it speaks to everything that we do today in child-centered. So it really starts with what is your nature? What is your idea of the nature of the person? I know that kind of is a deeper way to look at things, but that's kind of how it starts, because that is where we start to figure out how are we going to work with people, is what do we really believe about people. And so I like to take us all the way back, far back, into some of our philosophers and what they believed about the nature of the person, because then that speaks to how are we going to work with the person, specifically children. So I like to kind of look at the dichotomies of belief systems. And so if we look at Hobbes, um, he talked about the more kind of negative view of how people come into the world, how they are in the world. So these are quotes from Hobbes: of the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So you get this idea of a pretty negative view of uh, how Hobbes saw the person. And Hobbes really isn't the only one. There are a lot of people that have believed that through the history of time and today. So hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war as is of every man against every man. So here we have Hobbes saying, if there isn't somebody guiding you, and here when he talks about power, he's talking about specifically a God power, but that could be any power that is put on top of others to control who they are, what they do. Because if the person is left to kind of do whatever is instinctual, then that is going to lead to destruction of the self and destruction of others. So I like it. I sound pretty negative in that, and you might be thinking, oh my gosh, does anybody really think that negatively? And yeah, we have an entire history of the world where not only do people think that and believe that and have that philosophy, but then certainly evidence of how people hurt each other, politics, all of those kind of things, that how left to our own devices, that we are going to hurt each other and hurt ourselves. And so therefore we would need a guide. We would need something to guide us, because we wouldn't be able to be left to ourselves. And so this is this is a long history of this across the world in all geographic areas of having this belief system that has always kind of come through. It is certainly a philosophy that is influential in the United States, because we're going to talk about the growth of play therapy taking place in the United States. And so we would want to know that the context of that growth of play therapy did come from those early settlers of the U.S. and who had a very puritanical viewpoint of, if we look at children, that they are going to move toward evil unless they have somebody to move them toward goodness. So we want to recognize the impact that this philosophy has on what we do today and even the therapeutic approaches we choose. So, so that's one end of the spectrum. And then in France, we had Jean-Jacques Rousseau write a book called Emile, and I'm sure I'm saying that incorrectly, since it's in French. But in this book is where he makes the case for that people are actually really good, that by nature, that nature made me happy and good, and if I am otherwise, it is society's fault. So, and God makes all things good. So this philosophy was growing in the European world during this time in the 1700s. And this idea that no, I think that people are born with this goodness within them, and that if left to their instincts, they will move toward more goodness, toward relationship, toward helping themselves and others. So very dichotomous views of how people come into the world. And so again, what does this mean for what we believe about children? So this particular philosophy starts to make its way in the U.S., who has really been focused in on this more um, idea that if children are left to their own devices, that bad things will happen, evil will happen, it will move them toward evilness. So then kind of floats over from Europe is this idea of, oh no, children are really wonderful creatures and are beautiful to watch them grow, and we can trust them and trust their instincts. And so again, this began to take hold in the United States, and there became this dichotomy of influences and a lot of arguing around how did that, what does that really mean for us and how we raise our children. So again, we're not even talking about here about play or therapy. We're just talking about how we look at children and what goes on with how we should guide them or parent them. And then that's going to have a great influence on then what are we doing with children. So one thing I always like to ask when we talk about child-centered play therapy is, if you are given these two perspectives, where do you fall? Because I want you to take a few seconds right now and think about, where do you fall on this continuum? Because I'm guessing that most people who are interested in play therapy aren't going to fall completely over to Hobbes' side. And then I think probably majority don't fall completely over to the Rousseau side. So if you put them on the ends of a continuum, where do you think that you fall? Where would you fall in that continuum? What do you believe about how people come into the world? What is their nature? How much can they be trusted on their own without guidance? And you can probably see where I'm going there on, if we don't trust children, then that means it might be our role to be more guiding of them, and how guiding should we be of them. So all of that is going to be dependent on what is your belief about the person, and that can have so many influences. This could be your family of origin, your spiritual religious beliefs, it could be your experiences in life. All of these things can impact your belief system, but your belief system has everything to do with where you're going to go with your play therapy approach. And we will see it had heavy, heavy influence on what was happening in the development of play therapy over time. So that's why I do like to spend a few minutes talking about this, because it's going to keep coming up over the time that child-centered play therapy has grown. And so when we talk about um, children, we inevitably are going to talk about play. That play is part of what children do. This was something that early on has been observed by adults, that children like to play, children enjoy playing, that it is something that they seem to need to do. Uh, that was definitely something that's been observed over time and over history with children. The meaning of that play is where things started to change, because somewhere around the 1850s to the 1900s, there started to be this observation of children are doing something in their play that seems bigger sometimes than just having fun. And so, is play something that's essential for children's growth? Is it essential for development? Is it essential for how they deal with problems? These were the questions that started to come up in the 1850s to the 1900 times, when adults started to take more interest in what is going on with children, and when they do play, what does that mean for them, and what does that mean for adults in our observation of children? Does it have more meaning than what we have thought previously? So you have this rise of interest in play. And again, this influence of the philosophy. So some people are saying, okay, yes, you can let children play up until 5 or 6 years old because they're young and they can't really contribute to society yet. So we're not going to really get into their play or influence their play up until that. But once they hit the age, which at that point would have been 5, 6 years old, that they could actually contribute, that they could be productive in society, then they really don't need to be playing. They need to be learning a skill, learning to be what they can contribute, learning to know what they can contribute to their communities. And if you don't do that with them, then you're going to just lead them to a life that is going to be unfulfilling, miserable, possibly laced with evil. So there you had that belief system pretty strong. And then you have others that are looking at, no, this thing about play seems to be contributing to their learning. It seems to be contributing to their health, to their development. So maybe we should allow them to do more of it. Maybe we should allow them to do more of it that we don't have any guidance over, to see if that in some way contributes to a better life for them. And so we have that growing 1850, 1900s, a lot of that talk happening. And there becomes an interest in children's play, more so than this is something that they do or this is something we shouldn't let them do, and more into, hey, we think something's going on. What is going on? And is it in any way related to their development to become a happy, full functioning person? And Chudikoff wrote a book on children at play, which I think is a great history of play in the United States. And what he noticed in the play is that children play has just always been a part of their culture, and that they have always had this desire to play and possibly to separate themselves as a culture, as a child culture, into their play. So, one of the threads he notices throughout the history of time, at least in the US, is that children have this quest for autonomy and a demonstration of creativity. So, if you look at the history, that children are kind of will intentionally separate themselves from adults in order to have a play experience for their own culture of childhood. And so I like this photo, because it's just something we would look at today and go, oh my gosh, that looks so dangerous. And yet, children are constantly engaging in risky play and play that is away from adults. Even today, just kind of looks different, away from adults, so that they can engage in what they need to do that seems to be instinctual to them, and that we possibly might figure out has meaning and has contribution to their development. And of course, play always comes with creativity. No matter how they're playing, it is seeking to access their internal creativity, and then how they can use that throughout their life, and how they can use it to better their life. So we want to this idea of play, and it's essential part of looking at the development of children. This became more and more acknowledged and observed as we hit the 1900s. And so then we have, when we talk about mental health, that are always coming back to Freud. And and if you read the history of play therapy, you're almost always going to hear this reference to little Hans. And so I do like to talk a little bit about little Hans because he is an interesting person. We could say character, but he was an actual person in the history of the development of play therapy. The picture that you see on the left is Sigmund Freud, and it is said to be Sigmund Freud with little Hans, but that is probably misinformation. So one of the things I will thread a little bit is the amount of misinformation that you find on the history of play therapy if you just go to the internet. So this is one example of that, that is by all accounts not little Hans, the baby that's sitting with him, but it has been attributed to being him. Little Hans is actually the adult picture on the right is little Hans as an adult. And so why does this matter to play therapy? So Freud was doing his concentration in psychoanalysis. He was working with adults. That is where his expertise was. It's where his interest was. And of course, he was interested in childhood and developing and developmental stage that we're aware of. But he never actually worked with children. That wasn't part of his concentration. When he talked about childhood, it was like basically, how does your childhood lead to you having all of these problems and symptoms and defense mechanisms as an adult? That childhood is basically a lead-in to all the problems that you're going to have in adult. That's really what his concentration was. And in his the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society was another psychoanalyst who was a father of little Hans. And the history of little Hans, this is an interesting story, and we don't have much time, but I'm going to go ahead and share it. The history of little Hans, what was going on with him is that when he has a mother, he has a father. The father is a psychoanalyst in the Vienna Society, and his mother, he was a first child and for 3 years an only child. And so his mother had a very strong reaction to him touching his penis, playing with his penis. And I know you're not surprised by me talking about these things. But she was had a very negative reaction and would be very negative with him. And so if he was seen touching himself, she would tell him that it was wrong. She would threaten that if he touches his penis, then that he would lose his penis. And so very much using kind of threatening language. And so he was developing these fears. He also has a younger sister who's born, and then about 3 years old. And then there's an incident where he's in the bathtub and he asked his mom to touch his penis, and she really had super negative reaction to that and did a lot of threatening and scaring him about this request. So then what happens, and so that's, kind of that early part. And then what happens and why the father was so worried about Hans was not about any of that. What he was worried about is Hans develops this intense phobia about horses and horses carrying carts. So if you think about the timeline, this would be most transportation is done through horses and carts. And so he had to be around them in the streets and the roads. And he had an intense phobia that the horses would be loose, that they would kill him and kill others, and that carts would crush people. And so he couldn't even be really going out into the road because of this phobia. And so this is where his father, the psychoanalyst, gets really worried about him. And so he starts engaging with Sigmund Freud on, can you help me with this? What should I do about this? And so what Sigmund Freud does is he encourages the father to basically have play sessions to analyze the child's play. So have the child play, and then the father would observe the play and then would write it and then send it to Freud, and then Freud would interpret it. So it shouldn't be surprising that the early part of what I explained about little Hans was all about penis and losing his penis and that kind of thing, because that goes at Freud's developmental theory. And so I'm not even sure if that's a very true event that occurred for him, but that is how Freud interpreted it. And so they engaged in this letter writing and play observation and interpretation between each other. And so through that is where we have our first account of play being used therapeutically. And we have to kind of know it comes from a psychoanalytic point of view. So it was just observation and analysis. And Freud thought that if the father could interpret the play correctly, then this would get rid of the phobia. There's really not a lot more on that about did the phobia actually go away. It's just what is typically referred to in the play therapy world as the first case of play therapy. I do want to point out, as you can tell from my description of it, it isn't what we would call play therapy today. It's closer to filial, maybe the first filial play therapy, but it is, not an individual therapist then doing therapy with a child. However, any of the history on play therapy, you're going to see this referral to little Hans, and that's really the story of little Hans. And so we have this growing of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. And the next person you usually see in the history is Hermione Hug Helmuth. And we, again, don't have time to go into great detail about Hermione, but so I'm just going to give you the highlights of, so Hermione is the first person in the Psychoanalytic Society to write about analysis of play. She wrote it about her nephew, and there was quite a bit of negativity that went on in that relationship, a long, long history of that, of what went on between the two of them. And but she wrote this article, what we would call an article today, about how she watched his, basically interpreting a dream that he described, and then watching his play and interpreting that. She never actually engaged in anything with his play or had a session with him. She was interpreting play that she was just observing. And this became a huge connection to, oh, wait, we probably should be doing something with this in therapy, because her nephew had many problems. And so a lot of those were coming out in his play. So Hermione is often mischaracterized as being the first play therapist. So I want to be super clear about that. She never actually did play therapy. She never actually did therapy with the children. She just would watch and then write about what she saw. But it was a huge transition for the play therapy world, because it was like, okay, well, we probably need to start working with this. We probably need to start doing something with this. Just a cautionary tale of the dual relationship thing, which, that wasn't a big deal back then, and because of the things that happened because of that is why we make it a big deal today. Her nephew ended up murdering her, blaming that she used him in her career. And so when he got to adulthood, he ended up killing her. There's a lot of context to that, but for the purposes of today, I'm just sharing the sad ending of that, personally how it happened, and then professionally how it moved the field forward. So you're getting a sense, if we go back to philosophy on the psychoanalytic side, is they are really working toward this idea, and we know this from psychoanalysis, is that man cannot be trusted, that a child could not be trusted to their own devices, because they are going to develop all of these neuroses based on basically the negative way that they enter into the world. And so the psychoanalytic way is the first way that people start looking at play, but it is in a pretty negative human nature light. And really, one of the biggest things that happened in play therapy is between Anna Freud and Melanie Klein. So Melanie Klein came first, and these are people I hope you're aware of in the play therapy history. A huge movement, progress toward now we're going to start doing play therapy. So Melanie Klein does play therapy from a psychoanalytic. They were both part of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. And Melanie Klein believes in using the play session to interpret the play. So she is interpreting the play according to psychoanalysis theory. So she'll go into a session with a child, and then she will talk about, okay, here's what the meaning of what their play was. That so it was movement forward in that, hey, there is something important happening in their play, and we can use it to interpret their problems. Basically, how can what are their problems that they're experiencing, and so we can use their play to do that. And then Anna Freud, her way of working was slightly different because she really took on that idea of the transference relationship. And Melanie Klein didn't believe that the relationship was an important piece of what was going on. You watch children play, you see what they're doing, there's meaning to it, and then you interpret it. Anna Freud believed that that's not going to work unless you have a relationship with the child. So in her practical experience of working with children, she was noticing that their play would not go anywhere. Nothing was really meaningfully happening in their play if they did not have a relationship with the therapist. And this is a huge change. And so you start to see the inklings of child-centered coming through, because she's saying, hey, we can't even really look at their play unless the relationship is there. So I'm going to keep going really quickly through this because, again, there's so much to this, but we're hitting the highlights here. And then you might ask, okay, so what does that mean for today? Well, it did have a huge impact. These two people were not friendly with each other. They did not appreciate each other's work. They did not respect each other's work, and you have in the literature, there's criticism that they criticize each other's work. So this is something that we want to acknowledge, because there starts to be this huge geographical impact that happens. Because Melanie Klein stays very essential and influential in the European area on play therapy. So now play therapy is being used from a psychoanalytic point of view. And Melanie Klein saying this is how you use it, and it's really taken hold in the European world. Not surprisingly, if you think about how Anna Freud talked about play therapy, her ideas, she visited the US, of course, but her ideas start to take hold in the US. Just as Rousseau's ideas started to take hold in the US, Anna Freud's ideas start to take. And if you know US culture, there starts to be a lot of making sense about this more authentic way of being, relational way of being. It's kind of a culturally embedded a lot in US history. But her ideas really take hold in the US, and that starts to grow. I have these two quotes in here just so you can see that these are two professionals who did not really like each other's work. So you've got Melanie, who's saying that she really doesn't think that what Anna is doing is helpful in the therapy, about that it's not important to do that relationship part. And then you have Anna later talking about Klein saying she thought she was interpreting things that she didn't really understand. So they are in the literature and at conferences kind of really emphasizing their points and not being very friendly with each other. Okay. And I just want to point out, I'm not going to spend hardly any time because I really want us to get to the more direct child-centered stuff. But just to know that so Anna Freud's ideas are taking hold in the US. Also, what's happening in the US is this growth of child guidance clinics, which did come from Europe, and it came from Adlerian tradition of these child guidance clinics. So they knew that there were issues with children, that they needed to be raised in a way. Certainly children who were experiencing problems need to be raised in a certain way. These child guidance clinics start popping up in the United States. One especially famous one is the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic. And now they are working with children, and they really don't have any systematic approach to work with children. And so coming out of this movement in the child guidance clinics, they're having, because previously they really were designed to work with parents and not directly with children. So now they're trying to figure out, okay, what do we do with these children that are coming in, who we have to say, you have to remember what kind of children would be coming in for therapy in the early 1900s, and we're talking right now about 1920 to 1935, who would be coming in. It would be children who have significant symptoms, problems. And so they're kind of scattering, trying to figure out what to do. And they really start to embrace this idea of play therapy. And so the first get together conference, basically, that also then put out everything that they talked about in a section of the Annual Journal of Orthopsychiatry. It is the first, now we have documentation of what is this play therapy thing, what is going on. And so these are the leading people, this citation here is the leading people in the play therapy world at that time. So if you look at that date, that's 1938 is when we had our first play therapy conference. And so that was kind of an exciting thing. Uh, Again, just quickly looking through this, recognizing some of the names. These are names that are probably not, that you don't know, because they're ones kind of, suppressed in the literature, like people aren't aware of how much they contributed to where we are today in play therapy. One of the fun things about the history is when they had this conference is they really, every single one of them who has a conference proceeding, like a written document of what they talked about, really does not like this term play therapy, and they put it in quotations whenever they use the term. And I just have record after record of each one of them saying, I wish there was a better name. We don't like this name. It tends to discount what we're actually doing. A lot of what we deal with today in play therapy, that they were dealing with it from the very beginning. So they're writing about the play therapy coming from those perspectives, and starting to look at, I think more needs to be going on in play therapy than just putting children in a room with toys. So this conference, if you ever do get a chance to read about that, and again, I do a lot of more in-depth kind of history of it, but if you ever get to read it, they do spend time talking about, we started off just putting toys in the room, and that isn't what was working. The children seem to need more. And so they then start to put structure around it, the importance of the relationship, and we start to see a movement come away from just that psychoanalytic point of view and a more positive view of children kind of coming through that, children seem to be naturally working through things by doing this. And one of the things that one of the leading contributors to play therapy at that time, Helen Ross, she talks about the qualifications of the therapist, which I just love so much that I just couldn't not share it, even though it gets it a little bit into the details. But Helen Ross, from the very beginning, talks about what's needed in a therapist. And you can see this starts to be this impact of the relationship, how important it is. As it is facilitated by a therapist. So she describes that each therapist needs a deep interest and love for children, as opposed to a narcissistic need to discover what is wrong with somebody. So you can start to see, ooh, that sounds a little CCPT-ish, right? That sounds a little child-centered. They need a really scientific attitude, which enables one to evaluate data and make deductions. So they wanted from the beginning that we need to be accountable for what we're doing. We need to look at what we're doing and evaluate it and see how we can make it better. An untiring patience and a healthy personality. And this is something that from the beginning they noticed, okay, the therapist has a lot to do with this. And so we're going to need to look at what kind of people are coming into the field of play therapy. Something that, again, really rings true today too. So they have this conference, and then things continue to grow. Frederick Allen, who really gets very little accolades for this huge contribution that he made, especially to the movement toward child-centered play therapy. I like to give little just tidbits, which I think was fun. But Frederick Allen was a track star on the U.S. Olympic team in 1912, so I thought that was kind of cool. And he finds himself as a therapist in the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic. And and really focuses in on the relationship and the importance of the relationship. I'm giving you quotes here that you can take time to read later. But if you look at the bottom of that, now he is engaged in finding what he can be in relation to a person who can both understand and yet limit the expression of feeling through action. Into the play or the more direct activity, the child can bring all the turmoil that is associated with getting established in a relation that has limits. So he's talking about, hey, the play itself does not seem to be near as important as what's going on in that relationship. And this is where we start to see it much more talking about, hey, the play is good. It's definitely how children communicate, but there seems to be more importance going on in the relationship with the therapist. Um, and again, I try to give you more quotes about that and how important it is to less attention will be given to the particular content which emerges, but attention will focus on the unfolding of the relation itself and how this movement can be understood in the play activity. So again, heavy concentration on the relationship between the therapist and child seems to be the predicator for change for children and how they play and affects the content of how they play. This just two quotes from him. Effective therapy with a child depends upon the changes a child can make in himself through the medium of a therapeutic relationship. The therapist has no power to do that changing. If his point of view stems from a belief that he can change a child, irrespective of the participation of the child, he will introduce a real barrier to therapy. So Frederick Allen writes this book, Psychotherapy with Children. It is not called play therapy. That comes later. And again, we don't have time in this session to talk about that. But it is really the beginnings of what we are going to later see Axline talk about, is what is going on in this relationship and how if we don't have solid relationships with the children, we're not going to see play therapy work. The play isn't as important. And so a couple of things to point out in the history, because there's, again, a lot of misunderstanding of the history, is by the 1930s, they had already termed the term play therapy. They were using the term play therapy. They were clearly talking and saying play is the natural language of children. Because sometimes I hear that statement attributed to Landreth or to Axline. It was used. We don't actually have the original citation for who said that first, because it was being said in the 1920s that play is the language and toys are the words. So this is something we want to really know our history so that we're accurate on that. So we can see how our child-centered play therapists have built on their ancestors, have they built on the previous therapist. And Frederick Allen is a main one that the child-centered people have built on, because he was working on it, he was evaluating it, he was figuring out how does this thing actually work. And so this book, Psychotherapy with Children, 1942, really brings together and sums all his work from mid-20s until the 40s. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this. I just want to let you know at the same time, because we have this humanistic thread really growing, really happening, so exciting for what's going on in play therapy. But we have to remember that the Hobbes way of thinking is still very much alive and also growing as in a parallel way. So we have the beginnings of what's now called release play therapy, structured play therapy. You actually don't hear about them talked much about them now, but they are integrated into several different therapeutic approaches that you will hear talked about. I'm giving you this, and you can take time to read it. Kind of maybe you want to pause your video and read it to give you an idea of what these are. But these are basically coming from the belief system that children aren't going to come in and do what they need to do. You are going to need to structure it for them, with the release play therapy by Levy being very structured. Like, we are actually going to set up a play scene, and I am going to have the child play this scene to work through what's wrong with the child. And that's really the perspective on it. And then later, a little bit looser, is Hambridge, who is a student of Levy, who comes in and talks about structured play therapy, which is not as quite as rigid, but still the same. You're still going to be picking out the toys. You're still going to be trying to facilitate some kind of abreaction in the child, trying to get them to work on what you think as the therapist they need to be working on. So we don't want to forget that this is growing at the same time as child-centered and is going to go in a different direction, which ends up sometimes being quite a bit of conflict with child-centered ways of thinking. Okay, so what I want to get to is this idea of how did we get to calling it child-centered and being child-centered. And I always love to talk about this because child-centered play therapy is rooted in person-centered theory, which is Carl Rogers' theory. Carl Rogers' first book, which a lot of people don't know this, his very first book that he ever wrote was the treatment of the clinical treatment of the problem child, which if you are familiar with Rogers' work, it'd be like the title alone is problematic, right? Is like, wow, that seems really negative. And if you read the book, it is very behavioral. You can tell Rogers doesn't really know how to work with children. But you start to see an inkling if you are able to read the book. You will start to see when he talks about parents, you start to see a breakthrough of what his belief system will later become very clear, which is how do you work with parents? And he has that in that book, like this idea of empathic understanding and acceptance and how much that's needed in working with parents. He just has not figured out how to do that with children. So Rogers will go on to, impact the entire world with his theory of believing in the relationship in therapy, believing in the growth towards self-actualization of each person, and how we utilize that in therapy to be helpful. So he publishes in 1939 is that child book, and I really just think Rogers was just lost when it came to children. But then he goes on and he starts to really formulate his theory on person-centered theory. And at that same time is when he meets Virginia Axline in the 1940s. Again, I put this in there. If you Google Virginia Axline, this picture comes up sometimes. And just to let you know, that is not Virginia Axline. She does not look like that and never did look like that. That appears to be hair from the 80s. But I just like to point that out to make sure don't believe everything you read on the internet because there is a lot of confusion and miscommunication. So this is Virginia Axline. This is what Virginia Axline actually looked at like. Virginia Axline is essential to the growth of child-centered play therapy. She's considered the mother of child-centered play therapy, the founder of child-centered play therapy. So what happens with Virginia is she is an early childhood educator, and I think this is an important piece because much of the beginnings of child-centered were coming from people who worked with young children, especially women who worked with young children. So Virginia Axline becomes a student of Carl Rogers, initially at Ohio State University. And she believes in what he is talking about and really grasps it and really develops a strong belief system in it and starts to practice it. And she gets it as far as children because she comes from that early childhood background. So she starts to take all of those concepts and starts to figure out how would you do this with children? Because Rogers just really didn't know. And he wrote a foreword to her beginning play therapy book that I think really clarifies that that she took those concepts and then she made them real for how you work with children because no one else could really figure that out. So this is this huge contribution. It is the beginning of child-centered play therapy as we know it. Virginia Axline goes on with Carl Rogers when he moves to University of Chicago. They have a working relationship. And again, we don't have time to get into the details of their relationship, but they have a falling out sometime at the University of Chicago. And after that point, they never speak again to each other. It reportedly that Axline did not want to speak with Rogers again, and there are several reasons for that, which again we don't have time to go into. But they have a falling out, and then she moves to Columbia University, where a lot of her work then comes from Columbia University. But she was doing it at Ohio State. She was doing it at University of Chicago. She writes this book called Play Therapy. Play Therapy was written way before her other work, Dibs, that people are more familiar with. But she writes Play Therapy. If you read it today, it is going to sound very familiar to you because we have held pretty true to it in Child-Centered about what is child-centered play therapy. She is not calling it child-centered play therapy. She's not calling it, she's just calling it play therapy. And then when she describes it, she describes it as non-directive. But she holds to all of Rogers' principles of working with children. Later in the 1960s, she writes a book, Dibs in Search of Self. And that book supposedly was about work that she did with Dibs, which would have been in the 40s. And that becomes a bestseller, which again kind of popularizes play therapy more publicly than it has been. All right. So what I have here on this slide is just a little bit summation of what she contributed. But these 8 principles of child-centered play therapy are what we hold to today for child-centered. And it has not changed. We continue to grow, and what does it look like, and how do we practically make it happen? But these are the 8 principles of child-centered play therapy. And this isn't a webinar that teaches child-centered play therapy, so I'm not going to go into them. Just want to point out historically, she's the one who gave them to us, and we hold to them today. And because they really describe the way we work based on solid theoretical principles of what works in working with people. All right. Onto the scene comes Chaim Gnott. He again was a psychologist, but then is very interested, finds Axeline's work, very interested in her, and becomes a student of hers. He contributes a lot to play therapy. He writes a group play therapy book. And again, if you read that book, there's a lot to be offended by today, because there's, he has definitely a psychoanalytic influence about looking at symptoms. And so there are going to be some things that are not going to translate well over time. But a lot of what he talked about in the 60s was way before his time. The relationship between parent and child, the trusting of children, how to work with children. He's so far beyond where most people are at the time, and completely influenced by Axeline and her way of working. So he writes a book called Between Parent and Child. He then writes Between Teacher and Child. I call him our first play therapy celebrity, because if any of you listening to this are a little bit older, if you remember the show Donahue, which was kind of like the Oprah of his time, in the 70s and 80s, Chaim Gnott was a regular on Donahue's show. Before he passed away very young, but he was a regular, and he became a celebrity on talking about parenting and best ways of parenting and schools and all of that. So he contributed a lot to moving us forward. He is, if you look at his history, he's the one, if you know Gary Landra's ACT model of limit setting. The original version of that came from Gnott with the AC part, acknowledging the child and communicating the limit. So a lot of things you read in his stuff, you will then see echoed in later works from Child-Centered. It's just this is just a picture of his book on play therapy with groups. And then we have Clark Moustakis, and Clark Moustakis, again, he was a student of Axeline. He was also later became a friend of Axeline, has a lot of affection for Axeline. And he felt, when he talks about his history, he felt too restricted by child-centered play therapy, and didn't feel like, because he was coming from this more existential background and bringing yourself as the therapist into the session. And he felt that CCPT, again, still not called that in wider community yet, but he felt like child-centered play therapy was too restrictive in him being able to be authentic. And so he basically modifies and creates play therapy that he then titles relationship play therapy. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as existential play therapy, existential humanistic play therapy. But then he actually titled it relationship play therapy later on. You will see many, many, many connections with child-centered. He did not veer far on that, on the belief that the children, it was more the way of working and the importance of how much the therapist brings to the relationship, which then by today's standards has been adopted. Like if you read any current CCPT literature by people who are grounded in CCPT, you will hear a lot of this bringing in what does it mean for the therapist and what do they need to be doing to be fully authentic in the relationship. Okay. And then we move to the 60s. And so when we come to the 60s, this is where we got terms child-centered play therapy. We now have the term. And then we have two major figures coming in to the development of child-centered play therapy. So the first are Louise and Bernard Gurney. And Louise is still alive today. I want to say that both figures I'm going to talk about are still alive today. And have contributed so much to our literature, to our understanding, to our growth, and to our history of child-centered play therapy. So, so they were followers of Axeline, and Louise and Bernie worked together. They created the relationship enhancement way of working, and so and they were out of Pennsylvania State University, and they very much followed a child-centered way of working based on Axelinian principles. And then they started to create this idea of, oh, we can do this with other people. We could teach these ways of being with children to parents, and then ultimately to teachers also. We can do this, and this will help build relationships between parents and children. So Louise and Bernard Gurney are the creators of filial therapy. And then they create the National Institute for Relationship Enhancement. They leave Pennsylvania State University. Bernard really continues to work in the area of couples, working with couples, because that was a high interest for the Institute. And Louise stays pretty true to the working with children aspect. So she continues to promote, to train this working in child-centered play therapy, and it's in the northeastern United States. And then creating this filial therapy of teaching parents to use play skills and play sessions with their children to enhance the relationship, the parent-child relationship. So very exciting, brand new kind of branch coming out of child-centered. And this is going to be taking place in the mid-1960s. And also Louise contributing to research in that area. So again, we have that really cool thing that goes on throughout the history of child-centered is this focus and commitment to showing, does it work? Being accountable. And so she's contributing to the literature there, growing in this way of working. And then we come to Gary Landreth, who is definitely, as far as current attribution, who mostly gets acknowledged and well-deserved as being leading child-centered play therapist. So Gary, and these are some from our University of North Texas archives, pictures of Gary in his 30s. And so Gary comes to the University of North Texas in the mid to late 1960s. And becomes part of he had been trained in play therapy in New Mexico, and really wants to contribute and to grow in this area for the University of North Texas. I have a little joke on there about you spell Gary with two R's. One thing is if you call yourself a child-centered play therapist, please spell Gary's name correctly. That is a pleading from me. I see it so many times misspelled about with Gary. So Gary spells his name with two R's, and I think that's a really good indicator of how much have you studied your child-centered play therapy is how do you spell his name. So please try to remember that. I'm going to emphasize it there. But what happens with Gary is he focuses in on this idea of promoting play therapy, and how do we do that, and how do we train others, how do we build, how do we make sure it's theoretically consistent. He is part of a clinic, an interdisciplinary clinic. That's the first kind of play therapy clinic at UNT, where he's part of an interdisciplinary team that offers play therapy along with other kind of educational services that were being offered. And this is like a very unique environment that play therapy starts to grow in at UNT. And we'll come back. He writes a book called Play Therapy. This is a copy of the one you're looking at is a copy of his first edition called Art of the Relationship. So Play Therapy, the Art of the Relationship, where he Gary starts to tell us, more about like, how does this actually work? And how do you work with parents? And what is happening with the child? And how is it grounded in our belief system? So he gives us this deep understanding of how does play therapy work. If you're wondering, I'm going to just take an aside here to say, if you're wondering about why is play therapy, if it's been around for 100 years, why is it not taken seriously? And I do like to, and I could give you example after example, but I'm going to give you one example of things that undermine credibility. And so this is just one example. So a lot of times in the professional literature, in the academic literature, where people go to determine whether there's credibility to interventions, um, that there are things being put out that discredit the play therapy profession, or what we do in play therapy. So this is just one example of what was a study that was published. And what they did was they brought children into a clinic, and children who had warts, and they put them into two different experimental groups. So one group of children was given play therapy, and it was described as child-centered play therapy. And then the other group of children was given play therapy and then given a threat of, if your wart doesn't go away when you come back, we're going to cut it off. And lo and behold, there were actually kind of mixed results, but more on the side of the children who were not given the threat, who just received the play therapy. Their warts went away more than the children who were given the threat. And so this was written up and basically then summarized that play therapy is a treatment for warts. And so you can see how if we have several of these kind of things coming out of the literature, people start to discount what we do. And so this became a big problem. And because at this point, child-centered is growing. So this idea that non-directive way of doing play therapy, if people are going to claim that it gets rid of warts, then it's going to be a discredit to what we do. And we have lots of examples in the literature on that really hurt our work. So one of the things is looking at the historical research to recognize that where have things gone badly for the reputation of play therapy. If you are interested, I think one of the best articles you can read is What the Research Shows About Play Therapy. That isn't just because I was a co-author on it. It is because we go through the history of the research and we go through the criticisms of the research in a very, open way of here's what people are saying. And so that article, which was published in the International Journal of Play Therapy years ago, was one of the first articles to look at, hey, let's look at the research because it's been around for a while, and let's look at the criticisms and let's see if there's any truth to them. And so this is our first outing for myself and Sue Bratton in looking at, okay, let's use the research to build our credibility. Okay, then there become other approaches to play therapy that are developed throughout the 60s and 70s. So I'm not going to talk about any of them. I'm just going to show you them. So because we just don't have time for that. But theraplay becomes in the 1960s, becomes a recognized therapy that's grounded in attachment theory. Violet Oaklander really working throughout the 70s, 1970s. How do you apply Gestalt theory to play therapy, and writes this book, Windows to Our Children, which I think is essential reading for all play therapists. And we see the growing of Gestalt play therapy. John Allen, at the same time, writes this book called Inscapes of the Child's World, which is how do you do play therapy from a Jungian lens. And also, I would say this book is required reading for all play therapists because it really helps us understand how are different approaches being used. And these are very grounded people. It is not how I work as a child-centered play therapist, but it's a very grounded way of working that these people have used to kind of train play therapists in working with children. Okay, and then we get organized and we have the Association for Play Therapy, which is a huge boost, not only to all of play therapy, but also to child-centered play therapy. The founders of the Association for Play Therapy were Charlie Schaefer and Kevin O'Connor. Charlie Schaefer is passed. Kevin O'Connor is still around and involved. And so we can really give them the credit for a lot of the growth in the world of play therapy because, and again, we don't have time to go into all the things that the Association of Play Therapy has done to promote what we do, but they have had a critical role in play therapy being considered credible. The Center for Play Therapy. So we talked about Gary Landreth, and so he's been at UNT. And in 1987, he finally gets together. If anybody knows the academic world, it can be very difficult to make something happen. And he finally gets the resources together to create the Center for Play Therapy, which is the first center for play therapy. You often hear about centers for play therapy now. The Center for Play Therapy at the University of North Texas is the model center. It's where others came to figure out how can we do this? So the mission of the Center for Play Therapy was to train, to provide services, and to do research and bring out the research in play therapy. Gary Landreth himself is obviously a child-centered play therapy, and this is a huge growth in child-centered. So Landreth himself starts to travel across the world. And starts to have impact, not just in the United States, but globally having impact with the book, Play Therapy, Art of the Relationship, being translated into many, many, many languages, and Gary doing training all over the world. And so this makes a huge difference in the growth of child-centered play therapy. That Gary is also very dynamic, very grounded, very focused on how do we get the word out of the best ways of working with children. And this made all the difference for the growth of child-centered play therapy. Okay. And then we have more approaches that have come since then with the Adlerian play therapy with Terry Cotman, cognitive behavioral play therapy, mostly formalized by Susan Nell, but talked about a lot by different people. We have the development of the child-parent relationship therapy. This is the next wave of what comes from filial. So filial was developed by the Gurneys. Gary picks that up and very interested. He and Louise were close, and they were colleagues and close colleagues and very respectful of each other's way of working, which were both very much solidly within a person-centered way of working, just maybe a little differences here and there in how the approach is practiced. But Gary takes this idea of filial from the Gurneys and wants the original filial model was a year-long program with parents, and Gary wanted to make it let's make it more short term, that maybe it would be more practical. We could get more parents involved. And so he starts to come up with this idea of a filial model that's 10 sessions long. And then comes Sue Bratton onto the scene, and they start to create this 10-session model that it can be manualized, that can be, we can take this and use this with parents in a pretty structured way to spread the kind of CCPT ideas and practices that build parent-child relationships. And so that is called child-parent relationship therapy. Okay. Other models that are known are the ecosystemic play therapy model by Kevin O'Connor and prescriptive play therapy by Charlie Schaefer. Just want to make sure I acknowledge those. And then going back specifically to child-centered. So when I came on the scene, which would have been, 28, 29 years ago, and there was so much criticism of child-centered play therapy, of play therapy in general, and then definitely of child-centered play therapy. And so one of the things that was very concerning is how much negativity there was. I could talk all day long about that. It's so hard to understand the intentions of people in doing it, but there's definitely intentional discrediting of child-centered play therapy and of play therapy in general. And we had so much research. It was just so apparent that we had this research. Axeline was running research in the 1940s on child-centered play therapy. So Sue Bratton and I worked together to put together the meta-analysis on play therapy. And it was a way, there had been a smaller meta-analysis done by Michael LeBlanc. And then we were like, okay, well, we have more resources because we were at the University of North Texas. We have more resources. And so let's see how much we can put together, and let's see, does play therapy actually work? So the meta-analysis that we did that came out in 2005 was a big game changer for looking at play therapy. One of the pieces of evidence of that is that this particular article has been cited 1,658 times in Google Scholar. It's also the most cited play therapy article in Psych Info, a database on psychology articles. And so it did have this influence in, okay, we finally have something that shows that play therapy is effective. One of the sub findings in this study was that we found that the humanistic play therapy models seemed to have higher effect sizes, meaning they were showing bigger effects than the non-humanistic. So that also was a huge piece coming out of this, that, oh, not only are we giving more credibility to play therapy, we can give especially credibility to child-centered ways of working. And because of this, we started, that meta-analysis led to a change in how research was being done in play therapy. So for myself and for Sue Bratton and then others that have been involved, we started to become more rigid with the research methods. So to make sure that they could be reviewed as being evidence-based, because we can remember at the same time historically in the 90s is the growth of the evidence-based movement into the 2000s, of where in the mental health world, that in the US, that we aren't even allowed to do interventions that aren't considered evidence-based. So that the meta-analysis was the kickoff, specifically for me and Sue for sure, on how do we start to change our research to make sure that play therapy is credible. And then we were especially interested in the credibility of child-centered play therapy research and child-parent relationship therapy research and child-centered group play therapy. So the good news about that is we manualized those. So the manual for child-centered play therapy is in the advanced play therapy book. The manual for CPRT is in the filial model book. And then the manual for child-centered group play therapy by myself and Dr. Chang is available in the on the Center for Play Therapy website. And the manualization was, again, a huge piece of play therapy, child-centered play therapy moving forward, because we were not being recognized because it was, oh, what you're doing is too diffused, it can't be defined. So there's no way we can put you in this evidence-based category because you can't even really explain to us what you do. So the manualization was a big piece in making a change for the recognition of child-centered play therapy. So because of that, those things happening, the research, again, the methodology becoming more stringent, the manualization, and the showing good effects of child-centered play therapy. Child-centered play therapy was then recognized by the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare in those three, for CCPT, CPRT, and CCGPT, were all recognized, were and are all recognized as by the CEVC. And then we were also recognized when SAMHSA in 2017, child-parent relationship therapy and child-centered play therapy were recognized by SAMHSA in the United States. And then a year after we were recognized as being evidence-based, the SAMHSA list went defunct. And so then it was no longer existed, and then came back later as the Title IV Prevention Services Clearinghouse. So that is Title IV Prevention Services Clearinghouse is the entity, the federal government entity that determines if mental health interventions for children are evidence-based. And so the Title IV has recognized, again, all three therapies as being evidence-based. So again, huge game changers on the credibility of child-centered play therapy now being recognized. And Title IV, if you weren't aware, if you cannot receive government funding for mental health interventions if they are not recognized by Title IV. So you can see how it's a huge impact on us being recognized, on CCPT being recognized. And I will say too, for your knowledge, is the CEBC recognizes those three play therapies and only one other, which is TheraPlay. There are no other play therapies that are recognized by the CEBC as being evidence-based. Title IV only recognizes these and TheraPlay. No, and not TheraPlay yet. So just these three play therapies. So no other play therapy approaches are recognized. And so that is something that I think all child-centered play therapists need to realize. Okay. So the next part of it is this growth in child-centered, is that we want to offer a community for child-centered play therapists to understand child-centered play therapy and know best practices. And so we have created the Child-Centered Play Therapy International Group, which is a nonprofit group. We are not out to make money. We are a group of child-centered play therapists who are dedicated to having a community, making a community of CCPT therapists who are grounded in what they're doing. Because there's a lot of stuff going on right now. This slide is just to show you kind of historically where things came from and how, our leading people historically, and then coming to today. So as we wrap up, that's, bringing it up to today. And one of the things about today is that we now have this huge rise of people interested in child-centered play therapy. We started the certification program at the University of North Texas for child-centered in 2018, something like that, 2017, 2018. We've seen a huge rise in people and their interest in becoming trained, and especially since the word has gotten out about the evidence base. NIRE, the National Institute of Relation Enhancement, also has certification for child-centered play therapists. Both of these organizations are very grounded because they were started by founding people, the Gurneys and then Landreth. And so both of these organizations are very committed to making sure that our practices in child-centered play therapy are grounded in the theory of person-centered, and that we stay consistent in what we do. So a key takeaway from the history is that we have this credibility that is grounded in theory, that now we have all the pieces together, that we have a rich description in how we do what we do, a rich, long history of describing what we do, showing what we do. A big part of CCPT is we always show what we do. And in the rise of the research and the credibility of the research. One of the drawbacks of all this recognition, is that there have been now people who are kind of this is just a caution of are using the credibility of child-centered play therapy in a capitalistic way, meaning that there are all kinds of trainings that I see on a daily basis on child-centered play therapy by trainers who are not trained in child-centered play therapy, and so, or certifications in child-centered play therapy, when the programs are not grounded in the real theory of child-centered. Every day I see advice on child-centered play therapy in the social media that is not consistent with child-centered ways of working. And so it's a caution of, because it's become recognized, entrepreneurs have figured out that this can be a way to make money. And so again, one of the goals of Child-Centered Play Therapy International is to provide a community where we are going to try and give you resources to let you know how does child-centered work in the least possible costly way. That we want people to know what is solid child-centered play therapy. We want you to be well trained in play therapy. We want you to recognize our history and how grounded it is in the two main areas that bring effectiveness to play therapy, which is theory groundedness and research. And child-centered play therapy has that, and has it in so many ways and so much frequency and with so many good effects, that we really want to make sure the good information is getting out to people who want to be child-centered, because we have it. We have just great information to share with people. So this is just a little beginning of what is the history of child-centered play therapy, how we got to where we are. This was only supposed to be an hour, but I know I'm a little bit over an hour, so hopefully you stuck with it for those last 15 minutes. And would love to hear more from you about your beliefs about child-centered play therapy. Again, we are going to be opening up community avenues for how we can exchange information and provide resources, and that'll be open to you using all that we have from our history to help inform what we do in the future. So I'm very excited to have shared all of this with you. Would love for us to spend, 6 more hours talking about history. That's even more fun. But this is, a great kind of summation of where we've been and where we're going. So thank you for joining me, and I'm happy that you have been a part of it. Thank you.